This is your vodcast on the nitrogen cycle. Please put nitrogen cycle as your title. First of all, like we did with the carbon cycle, a little bit about what is nitrogen. Hopefully you've heard of it before. It is an element, the symbol for the element being N, so you've probably seen that before. Most often in the atmosphere or in the air, it's N2 as a molecule. So that's what we're probably going to be dealing with most of the time during this podcast. It is necessary for life. We find it in lots of living organisms, but we also find it in non-living forms. So those are those words, that biotic and abiotic again. Okay, so make sure you're familiar with those from last time. I'm going to move on if you need to pause. Just like we did with the carbon cycle, I'm going to go through all the places where you can find nitrogen and then wrap them up in one final cycle. So again, we're going to start in the air, the atmosphere. As I said before, it is found as a gas in the atmosphere. So I wrote that down for you before, just a reminder though, that's N2 as a gas. And it actually makes as a gas up 70% of our atmosphere. So we don't realize that. We think about, okay, there's probably lots of oxygen in our atmosphere, but in reality, the majority of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Unfortunately, we can't just breathe in that nitrogen and use it. The nitrogen we breathe in, we also breathe out. So it has to be in a different form for us to use it. We can't use it in the gas form. So basically, the nitrogen cycle is all about how do plants and animals get that gas into a form they can use and then put into their cells. So how does it get into the atmosphere? First of all, there is a bacterial process called denitrification that puts the nitrogen into the air as a gas. And you'll see that bacteria do a lot of work in the nitrogen cycle. There are different types of bacteria that do all these things. You don't have to know that. But I do want you to know that the bacteria put the nitrogen into the air, again, through denitrification. It also gets pulled out of the air by a different type of bacteria, which the process is called nitrogen fixation. So you're fixing the nitrogen into a different place so it's not in the atmosphere anymore. I'm going to move on if you need to pause it. Okay, another place where we find a lot of nitrogen is in the soil. Usually in the soil is found as this compound called nitrate, which is a combination of nitrogen and oxygen together. And the way it turns into a nitrate, or how it gets into the soil, is again bacteria. There are these bacteria that are on the roots of a special plant called a legume. And a legume are plants like beans, so like soybeans, alfalfa, peanuts, and actually there are some trees. For example, there's a tree called an alder that can do this. These are all legumes. Again, it's the bacteria on the roots of these legumes that can actually take the nitrate out of the air and put it into the soil. Okay, so that's a pretty important role that they play. Also, nitrate or nitrogen can get into the soil through decomposition, but that's obviously from living organisms that have already gotten the nitrogen into their tissues. So if an organism dies through decomposition, it's going to put nitrogen into the soil. How do we get nitrogen out of the soil? Well, plants can take nitrogen from the soil through their roots. And then remember, there's that bacterial process again, that denitrification, that can send the nitrogen back into the air from the soil. So again, bacteria showing up an awful lot. Right, I'm going to erase this and move on if you need to pause. Okay, we do find nitrogen in plants. Pretty straightforward how it gets into plants. First of all, not through digestion. That's an error. Should be through uptake. We just talked about that in the last slide. So plants take up nitrogen through their roots from the soil, got there from that bacteria that was on their roots, and then they can bring it into the plant. And then they use it for, as it says up here, various compounds. Okay, lots of different things in plants need nitrogen in them in order to build those cells or those tissues. How do we get it out of plants? Well, plants do go through waste processes which remove nitrogen. Also, when they decompose, the nitrogen goes back into the soil. I'm going to erase this and move on. All right, nitrogen also found in animals like us in various compounds in our tissues and things. Oh. So let's see how it gets there. First of all, in order for us to get nitrogen, we have to eat it. Like I said, we can't just breathe in nitrogen from the air. That'd be awfully convenient, but we can't use it that way. So we have to eat things, usually other plants or animals that have nitrogen in them already. And that's how we get the nitrogen to build into our molecules. We get it out of our molecules by decomposition. So when organisms decompose, that nitrogen goes into the soil, as I said. And then for organisms that get eaten, for example, think in a food chain, a mouse maybe gets eaten by a snake. The nitrogen in that mouse then moves to that snake. So consumption can cause nitrogen to move from one animal to another. Okay, I'm going to erase that and move on. All right, this is where we put this all together. So up here is our nitrogen in the air. Remember, that's in a gas form, N2. From there, the nitrogen is taken into the soil by these little red guys. Those little red dots are supposed to represent the bacteria. Okay, so the nitrogen goes from the air to the bacteria, and then the bacteria put it into the plant, or put it into the soil so the plant can use it. So this little circle kind of here, this little cycle, again means that the nitrogen comes into the bacteria through nitrogen fixation. Then the nitrogen can go into the soil. The plants can absorb it from the soil and put it into their tissues. So I don't want you to get confused right here. The plant uptake, okay, is not from these little nodules on the roots. Okay, this is from the soil. Okay, the little red bacteria on here are actually putting the nitrogen into the soil. And remember, it's only special plants that can do this. Different legumes. That's why lots of times you'll see farmers will rotate their crops. So like one year they'll plant beans in one field, which will help put nitrogen into the soil. And then the next year they'll plant corn there. Corn does not have these little bacteria on its roots, and so it's just soaking the nitrogen out of the soil without replacing it. So the next year often farmers will put beans in the soil again in that field so that it can replace the nitrogen. So remember, only specific types of plants can do that. Okay, next in our cycle then, plants, as we know, can be eaten. That nitrogen from the plants goes into the animal that's eating it, in this case cattle, and it can be eaten again. And again, here's the little boy eating his meatballs. And so in both of these cases, we've got digestion moving nitrogen through the cycle. So the nitrogen that was in the plant goes to the cows. The nitrogen that was in the cows goes into the human. As before in the carbon cycle, all three of these decompose. So when humans or animals or plants decompose, their nitrogen goes back into the soil with the help of some little bacteria. Okay, that's our little red dots there. So again, nitrogen is moved around through the cycle with the help of different types of bacteria. Finally, remember there are other types of decomposers as well. So mushrooms, for example, different types of fungi can also help form nitrogen from decomposing organisms. But eventually all of that nitrogen that builds up in the soil, remember there's a final type of bacteria that moves it back into the atmosphere through a process called denitrification. Okay, so really this is a little bit more straightforward than the carbon cycle because there's only one way we can get nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and that's our nitrogen fixation. And there's only one way we can put it back into the atmosphere, which is our denitrification. Okay, and then nitrogen moves among the living things on the planet, among the biotic things. So the plants and the animals and different processes will move it around. But really, to get in and out of the atmosphere, there's only two ways that can happen. All right, this is the end of the vodcast on the nitrogen cycle. Again, as you did in the carbon cycle, make sure that you write down what all these processes are and connect them with the arrows and the pictures. And the pictures don't have to be detailed, just a general idea of what we're moving the nitrogen between. So if you need to pause it here to take some time to finish this cycle in your notebook, go ahead.